Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 160 and I'm the show's host Kyle. On today's episode of Foreign Policy Focus, I'm going to be discussing the Trump speech at the CPAC conference. The speeches have been very important in the past leading up to who gets the nomination for the presidential candidate and stuff like that, so this draws a wide audience and a lot of media, and of course Trump being the president always draws a big crowd, but he gave a speech and this was a long, and so I braved all 80 minutes and cut out the little bits that were, I felt, related to foreign policy and really important for me to discuss on this show. So if you're interested in that, please think about sharing the show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, or immersionnews.com. Alright, just for, I guess, kind of a general setup to the speech. Like I said, long speech. It was like 80 minutes, a lot of clapping, a lot of USA chanting. I think a couple times during the speech, somebody got up and protest. From what I've seen, and I've watched most of Trump's big, or read most of Trump's big speeches now, and this is by far, since at least becoming president, his most campaign-style speech, and I think his most off-the-cuff speech. He spent several minutes messing around, doing a little funny bit about his bald spot in the back of his head and a couple other things. He was very animated during the speech. As far as it goes, I think this was probably one of Trump's better speeches having been president. Not that any of his other speeches have been particularly bad, but this is, kind of a reminder as to candidate Trump being able to give very entertaining speeches that, what was out there to draw the crowd. That's not necessarily a comment either on the content of the speech, just what, felt like quality. I think that's important because, as far as it goes, if Trump is speaking a little bit more off the cuff and a little bit more just, his thoughts on the issues, then maybe we get a little bit more of what Trump is actually pushing, for as, president here and what's important to him. He did spend an awful lot of time bragging, throughout the speech there, and that was quite annoying, but, this is what the politicians do, I suppose, and Trump is definitely a, politician now, despite what he talks about in his speeches. So we didn't get to really any talk related to foreign policy whatsoever until about 25 minutes into the speech when Trump addressed military spending. And I'll go ahead and play the first clip.
But we're doing what's good for our country for the long-term viability and survival. Like, for instance, $700 billion got approved for our military. Our military was going to hell.
And this just seems to be, one of those standard lines. And there's plenty on the left too. There's not enough money for schools, even though no harm. Similar to what we have going on here with the military, where no matter how much money the military gets, no matter what, the Republicans always say, oh, the military is crumbling. We have to spend another $50 billion on this to make sure the Russians or the North Koreans or the Chinese or the Iranians or the terrorists or the Syrians will come and invade us. Of course, if you look at what's being spent in the military right now, they lose track worth of hundreds of millions of dollars. All the money is misspent. If you look at the F-35, which is a plane that is really no good whatsoever, yet is going to be $1.5 trillion in its lifespan. We're thinking of upgrading our nuclear weapons and nuclear triad, and Mark Perry was on the Tom Woods show pretty recently, and I will go ahead and link to that episode in the show notes page. And Mark Perry really explains why a lot of this money being spent is unnecessary, specifically talking about like the nuclear posture review and stuff. But the overall, idea here that the American military is underprepared or ill-equipped just simply isn't the case. I mean, in most cases, while we way overspend on our military capabilities, a lot of it is very good. It's just overused. If you look at why the 7th Fleet ships were having so many problems in the Pacific and, running aground and running into other ships, it was because, poor command, the locators were off, and also because they were just being used too often. It wasn't because our ships weren't good enough. Also, the idea that spending $700 billion when the, U.S. national debt is already, $20 trillion at this point. How, if you're already so much in debt, how could it ever be a good idea to continue spending and not cut spending? Trump also pointed out at one point in this speech that every time we spend another $100 billion on the military, we have to give the Democrats $100 billion on some other program. And so, like I said, if you're looking at the long-term benefits of the United States of America, the $20 trillion in debt certainly has to be a bigger and more immediate problem than any opposing military force. I mean, it's hard to prove that we couldn't work with the Russians in Syria, and it's only the United States that is keeping us apart there. He then goes in to mention the Iran nuclear deal. I feel like I broke this down pretty well on a couple other shows, specifically on Trump's speeches. One, the State of the Union address, and two, the national security statement show that I did with Will Porter. So I'm going to link to the one I did with Will in the show notes page. That way you all can watch that, but I'm not going to go through and explain the Iran situation again for those of you repeat listeners who have heard that several times over. But this is where Trump spends a good portion of the speech, and I think that's worth noting, where he goes on and on about how we gave the Iranians all this money and how this is terrible for America. Although he really never talks about like how the Iranians are really a threat to Americans. Now I want to move on to my next clip, and this is kind of where Trump goes as he trails off of the Iranian topic.
People that treat us well, we treat them well. People that treat us badly, we treat them much worse than they can ever imagine. That's the way it has to be. That's the way it has to be.
So this seemed to me to be a little bit of an off-the-cuff statement by Trump, and seemed to be kind of telling as to his view of the world. In that, if people treat us well, we'll treat them well, but if they treat us poorly, we'll treat them poorly. And there doesn't seem to be a middle ground here. It's not that the Iranians have really ever treated the Americans poorly since maybe 1979, 1980. In fact, if you look at more recent years, the Iranians benefited off of the 2003 war in Iraq, and then they helped us to defeat the Islamic State both in Iraq and Syria. The Iran nuclear deal went through, and so I think it's really hard to prove that like the Iranians are enemies of the American people, and for that reason we have to treat them poorly. I mean, you could bring up some of the rhetoric from their more right-wing and hardline leaders like Ahmadinejad saying death to America. But at the same time, we have presidential candidates like Ted Cruz suggesting that we should turn Syria to glass, or Donald Trump saying that we should torture people again. So if there was somebody in Iran making the case, oh, well, we have to treat the Americans poorly because look at the way their leaders talk about us, Americans would say, well, this is just rhetoric, and they just say this kind of stuff to, get votes. But we never see the inverse of that, where that's kind of what's going on in other countries too. And just the way Trump kind of says, this is the way it has to be. This is the way it is, that, we have friends and then we have enemies, and that there's nobody just kind of out there doing their own thing. And this is kind of admitted as to what we see from, let's say, the national security strategy, where Trump says that these powers really are just outside of the American orbit and not really interested in the old global order of the Americans, and not necessarily that they're in any way looking to attack America. Now I'll move on to the next clip, and this is where Trump is discussing the U.S. Embassy being built in Jerusalem.
Because I put the word out that I may do it, right? I said I'd do it in my campaign. So that usually means unless I find something, I'm going to do it. I was hit by more countries and more pressure and more people begging me, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. I said, we have to do it. It's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. We have to do it. And I did it.
Okay, so here's what we're talking about from Donald Trump. He decides that he wants to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in Israel. And what this was doing was somewhat sending a message that the Americans now recognize Jerusalem not as kind of an individual or multinational city, but as an Israeli city. This is of course, a pretty hot topic for the Palestinians, many of them who used to be the people who own the city. So there's a part of them that want their land back, but also for historical and religious reasons, for the same reason that a lot of Jewish people feel that they have the right to live. But then Trump's reasoning for doing this is he said, well, I said I was going to do it, and a lot of people called me and told me I shouldn't do it, but, I decided to stick with it and do it anyways because it's the right thing to do. Now, Trump doesn't explain why it's the right thing to do, because I really think that you have a real struggle to find a real reason to actually move the U.S. Embassy into Jerusalem. I mean, there's a lot of right-winger groups and Israeli lobbyist groups who definitely would like to see that move, and I'm sure have rewarded Trump and Republicans for making that move. But at the same time, if you look at for practical reasons, I mean, it's just a symbolic move that kind of sends a message to the, Palestinians that you have lost the city of Jerusalem. Now, the reason everybody was calling them and telling them not to do it, and I'm sure these were Arab leaders, is one, a lot of these Arab leaders, Erdogan, Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, the Emir of Qatar, and the leader of the Emiratis. They are all allies of the United States, but at the same time, the plight of the Palestinians is kind of a uniting feeling among Muslim people, and a lot of them, especially the ones located in the Middle East, have a lot of popular support for those people. And so it puts them in a difficult position where they're kind of, versus their people versus their ally here in the United States, of course, is the world empire. So it's not very easy to tell them to, go to hell. As you notice, a lot of the Arab leaders were very silent on the issue. Erdogan was one that kind of spoke loudly, but then didn't do anything about it. So Trump, can't explain why this is a good move. He just says it's the right thing to do. There's really no reason that it's the right thing to do. The Palestinian people have just as much as, a right to their land in that city as anybody else, especially if that land was taken from them. So why the United States feels the need to weigh in over there and stick our embassy somewhere where, a lot of people feel it doesn't belong, and it's just going to create tensions and hostilities. And I'm always surprised at, how much Americans care about where the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem is located. It seems to me if that's going to be something that's going to appease a large number of people by just keeping our embassy in Tel Aviv, it just makes more sense to do that, I would think. Especially if you're an alleged conservative that really doesn't want to be intervening all the time in all these other countries because you believe in small government, not massive government. And this is kind of my last clip of Trump's main section on foreign policy here, and this is Trump explaining why the military is so important.
But if we don't have a strong military, you might not be allowed into this room someday, okay? You may not have your houses, your homes, your beautiful communities. We better take care of our military. These are the greatest people, and we're going to take care of our veterans. We're going to take care of the vets.
So this is, just one of the most ridiculous things I've heard somebody say. I guess not in a while, because politicians are always making these claims that America's under threat. But the idea that a hostile nation is ready to come in and take over America and prevent Americans from going to CPAC or kicking us out of our homes are completely ridiculous. If you look at what the American army is doing overseas, where, let's say, a group of Muslim men would like to meet at a community center, maybe they can't do so because one of our drones will go and blow up that community center, but there's no threat from anyone. Not Russia, not China, not North Korea, not Iran, that's going to come over here and invade the United States of America. We have this giant gun debate going on right now. Remember, I think there's as many guns as people in the United States of America. And, a lot of people like to point out, well, what could you do against, the American government or an invading army with an AR-15? And it's well, look at what's been going on in Afghanistan for the past 17 years. We're the most advanced military on the history of the planet. We have satellites. We could watch these people 24/7. We have hovering robots that constantly fly over their countries and monitor their activities. We account for most of the spending in their government. We've killed hundreds of thousands of them. We've displaced millions of them. We forced them to erect borders and border walls, and we put outposts in all their cities, and we try to take over from the littlest villages to the biggest cities, and we can't do anything. The Taliban control more of that country now than any time since 2002. And so the idea that the Americans would put up an awful, hostile to anybody coming to take over, we don't need the massive military for that. You could argue that you may need some military, but not $700 billion a year, especially not when your, nearest enemies like China is spending $250 billion and Russia at $60 billion. But this kind of stuff is super dangerous because people react to fear. And I think this is something that Trump, kind of alluded to in his speech, especially when he was talking about the gun issue, is that there's a lot of people that are advocating for policy and fear. And so if the warmongers and Donald Trump and the rest of the politicians could build up enough fear against people to get them to continue to spend $700 billion a year on the military, they're going to do it. The next clip I have came from the gun discussion, but I think it's kind of relevant, so I'm just going to go ahead and play it.
Also need to create a culture in our country that cherishes life and human dignity. That's part of what we're talking about. A culture that condemns violence and never glorifies violence. We need to foster real human connections and turn classmates and colleagues into friends and neighbors that want to fight for us.
Okay, so I went ahead and played this clip and I pulled it and I thought it was interesting just because Trump points out, and I think rightly so here, the problem when you have a lot of violence in your culture, you're going to get a lot of violence, kind of inward and within your culture as well. And so, if you kind of look at what American foreign policy does is it exposes millions of Americans to unbelievable levels of violence overseas. I mean, I'm sure what happened and the people that had to go in and clean up that high school after that shooting, that's a terrible thing. But just imagine, I posted an article about the people who are going in Afghanistan and who are tasked to clean up after suicide bombings in Kabul. And they talk about, pulling limbs, like they'll pull a leg out of a wall or something like this. And, there's not like a body attached. And there's all this other kind of horrific stuff. And so while the events, in the United States are certainly horrifying, and I don't want to take away from that, but by sending all these Americans overseas, all of our soldiers to go fight and sometimes cause this violence. We see this in a lot of the drone pilots developing PTSD as, they realize they kill innocent people and monitor people for days and then blow them up. And so, assuming that Trump has rightly identified this as a problem, it's just quite amazing to me that he doesn't see how the United States military is, kind of a large contributor, especially the, policy of going overseas and engaging in wars that we don't need to be involved in. 17 years in Afghanistan, the past 25 years really in Iraq, and years in Syria and Somalia and Yemen and Libya, where all of our troops inflicted unnecessary violence and were at times witness to it or victims of it. And so, if having a lot of violence in your community is a large problem, then yeah, let's look at that. Also, like I said, just before, to realize that while what happens in the United States with these shootings is horrific, and for, those people out there that are demanding action, take that at, your own pace. I'm not going to get into a gun debate on this show. But understand that this is a daily occurrence in some countries. And while you can see that, it shakes Americans to the core, they say, and it causes people to go out and protest. Imagine what happens in Yemen, where this happens day after day after day, where you could look through and you could see, one day a Saudi airstrike kills 14 people, the next day it kills 9 people, the next day it kills 10 people, but it's an entire family. You have ISIS suicide bombers there and all these other terrible things that are going on. And it's just, I guess, important to realize that, while these things are terrible and happen in the United States, and obviously, as people, we should do something to, try to prevent it. We could also prevent an awful lot of this from happening in an awful lot of other countries just by paying a little bit of attention and telling our politicians to knock it off. All right, the last 2 clips I have are on North Korea, and right at the end of Trump's CPAC speech, he mentions North Korea for about a sentence. I'm going to go ahead and play that clip.
I appreciate everything you've done. I do want to say, because people have asked, North Korea, we imposed today the heaviest sanctions ever imposed on a country before.
Okay, so what Trump is talking about there is America sanctioned, I believe, like 55 or 56 either ships or companies that are associated with delivering fuel to North Korea or taking exports of coal from North Korea. Now, under the sanctions that do exist, there's some amount of this that's allowed to happen, and that's because the North Korean people need a bare minimum of food and fuel, and to be able to export to pay for that. The sanctions that are in place in the UN, this doesn't change the amount of, whatever goods that North Korea is allowed to either import or export, but it may limit their ability to do so by not having the same number of shipping options open to them. Also, the United States kind of sets the standard that anybody who does business with North Korea doesn't do business with the United States. This, could create a real limit on the number of people willing to, take North Korean imports or export to North Korea. Some other bigger news that Trump didn't allude to in his speech is that the United States Coast Guard will be deployed, I guess, to the East Sea. So all the way on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, we're going to put our Coast Guard there to search and board vessels in hopes of discovering weapons contraband headed to North Korea. Now, I'm not sure if the North Koreans are importing any of the technology for their nuclear weapons program. I would suppose there's a lot of people around the world that don't like the United States and may have interest in helping the North Koreans. I'm not sure if the North Koreans would look to take that help or not. But at the same time, this is going to be a lot of U.S. money wasted overseas, when most of the time we're just slowing up imports of, necessary food and fuel to the North Korean people. Dan McAdams, pointed out on Twitter that these ships, they're not ships taking weapons into North Korea. They are ships that transport fuel. And so it's not like this is an Iranian ship with a, energy company sticker taped over the side of the vessel. This is an actual vessel that transports fuel. And Americans are, kind of claiming that we're smuggling it in underneath the ship. Anyways, the point is that these are, fuel ships. And so by blocking these ships from entering North Korea, we're basically starving and freezing the North Korean people to death. And so we have this idea that if the North Koreans have enough fuel to keep their houses warm, enough food to eat, they would never take a stand against the North Korean government and Kim Jong-un. But if we keep them cold enough and hungry enough, then they'll get mad and overthrow their leader. Of course, it never works that way. And a lot of times the leaders just exploit the sanctions to turn the public against the United States, which, in some cases they rightfully should be. The last clip I'm going to play isn't from the CPAC speech. It was at a question and answer with, I think, either the British Prime Leader or some high-ranking official in the British government.
On North Korea, the sanctions, if they don't work, are all options still on the table? Can I get your answer and also the Prime Minister's thoughts?
Well, to the second, we'll have to see. I don't think I'm going to exactly play that card, but we'll have to see. If the sanctions don't work, we'll have to go phase two. Phase two may be a very rough thing, may be very, very unfortunate for the world, but hopefully the sanctions will work. We have tremendous support all around the world for what we're doing. It really is a rogue nation. If we can make a deal, it'll be a great thing. And if we can't, something will have to happen. So we'll see.
Okay, so what the guy's saying is, kind of post CPAC speech, we get the announcement that we have all these new sanctions. And he's saying if the sanctions don't work, then what? Of course, I explained that the sanctions aren't going to work and that sanctions never do work. It's not like sanctions had this excellent track record of every time we put sanctions on a country, the people immediately overthrow their leader. In fact, it seems to me that sanctions are kind of the first step in building towards not nuclear, but military intervention with another country. If you take a look at, Iraq through the 1990s was under the whole time under sanctions. And then, 2001, 9/11 rolls around, and by 2003, we've invaded Iraq. The same thing in Syria. We had sanctioned Assad before we went in and invaded Gaddafi. I don't know if he had sanctions on him at the time, but there was definitely previously sanctions, like through the early 2000s and 1990s on Gaddafi. We certainly sanctioned Iran, Hezbollah, and the Houthis in Lebanon are in Yemen. And so, like I said, if you look at it, it's not like these sanctions have ever worked or there's any reason to believe that they're going to work in this case. And so while, they're kind of asking Trump based on the question is based on the false premise that the sanctions can't even work. But he's asking if the sanctions don't do what they're obviously not going to do, then what does the United States do? And Trump kind of says, well, we're going to move into phase two. And I guess the only positive that you could take away from this is that Trump doesn't outright say, well, we're going to nuke them. But, he says it's going to be very, very bad for the world. This seems to me to certainly imply war. And so this is the kind of thing that you have to worry about and be cautious about, is that there seems to be this kind of understanding in the Trump administration that there's a time running out situation in North Korea. And when you look at it, that's clearly just not the case. There's no reason today to believe the North Koreans are any more likely to attack us than they were yesterday, or really 10 years ago. I mean, even with the additional sanctions, the North Koreans are still saying that they're open to talk. Although that the, sanctions are moving closer and closer to the Americans just kind of outright, blockading North Korea. And so the North Koreans in the past have said that they would consider that an act of war, and I'm not sure how serious they are about that, because they say that about a lot of things. So I don't know. I mean, the fear about the running clock is that it's going to put the Trump administration or Donald Trump himself in a position where he's kind of getting anxious about hitting that nuclear button against North Korea. And boy, it just seems so easy right now that we can make a mistake there and end up in a nuclear war. And so, hopefully that's not the case. You have different people in the U.S. government coming out and saying the U.S. government isn't looking to do something militarily. It does seem from the Trump administration side that they at least have some idea to do something militarily against North Korea. I'm not sure, if we're any more likely to go to, nuclear war with North Korea than we were last year at this time when I was saying that I don't think it's going to happen. But it does seem like, I guess we are moving in that direction where tensions are more and more heightened. This is really unfortunate because the Olympics should present themselves with an excellent opportunity for peace, and really have. And I mean, up until tonight, when you're going to have a high level, I guess last night in South Korea, we're going to have a high level nuclear North Korea delegation attending the closing ceremonies. I mean, these are real chances and opportunities for real talks to prevent real war from breaking out. We're talking about, millions and millions, really, 2-3 million North Korean lives and hundreds of thousands of South Korean lives that could be lost in a war should it break out. And while Americans continue to fearmonger and say that the North Koreans are about to attack, it just simply doesn't seem to be the case. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show. I hope you enjoyed it today. So everybody, please check out my new website, immersionnews.com. It's still under construction, but it's functioning and it's got a lot of cool stuff up there already. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com to share the show, libertarianinstitute.org, Libertarian Union on Facebook. I set up a Patreon page. It's patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. So if you want to help out the show, I'm going to do like a bonus show. I think probably something refuting Matt's boot. And I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. Thanks everyone.